Very excited for today's guest. He is someone I've wanted to have here on the show for a while. Justin Williams, if you don't know him, he has covered Cincinnati for The Athletic for going on 6 seasons now, and his coverage will slightly expand to cover more of the Big 12 now that Cincinnati will be in the conference. So it seemed like a perfect time to get him on and talk about a few different things. Justin, welcome to the 10-12, sir.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little Cincinnati and a little Big 12 and obviously a little realignment, both from, two very different perspectives, as Cincinnati has been part of conference realignment many times, obviously. But let's start with Cincinnati, since that's the team you've covered since, most of the Luke Fickell days. Mm-hmm. Cincinnati, to me, heading into this season, is the biggest mystery team in the Big 12. It's especially from the Big 12 fan perspective. We feel pretty good about the teams that we know. There weren't any other head coaching changes among the Hateful Eight, as they are referred to. Then you have 4 schools incoming, so we're trying to get acquainted with them. But then you throw in Cincinnati with an entire head coaching change as Luke Fickell is off to Wisconsin. So Cincinnati really does feel like the biggest mystery team to me. You and I have kind of talked about this, we've done the offensive line ranking here on the show, and that was when we were like, I think it's these 5. We don't really know. That's one of a couple of teams with this. We're doing wide receiver rankings. It's like, I don't know, because there's a bunch of transfers and new names. So for Cincinnati, is that perspective accurate both from those kind of looking out and within? How much of a mystery is Cincinnati this year?
Yeah, no, totally. It's a mystery, even, to some extent within the team and on the coaching staff. That's changed a little bit now that they've got fall camp starting. But you mentioned the coaching change. The only team in the pack or in the Big 12 this year that had an offseason coaching change, which for a team with 14, a conference with 14 teams is kind of remarkable in kind of today's college football landscape. And I think they had 23 transfers, which, Colorado, that was like an afternoon for them. I realize that's kind of the norm. But definitely just a lot of overhaul on the roster. There's one returning starter on offense. And as you mentioned, the wide receiver room completely revamped, a new quarterback in Emory Jones. A number of those players, especially at wide receiver, were brought in after the spring transfer window. So, when they got out, and put the pads on today at practice, that was kind of the first time they had done that in a Cincinnati uniform. So definitely a lot of unknowns, a lot of question marks on what this roster will look like, what the depth chart will look like here over the next couple of weeks. And so, in general, because of the change in leadership and culture and style, really just a complete unknown, even for the most diehard Cincinnati fans of what this team will look like on the field this season. There's obviously a ton of excitement because they wanted to get back to a power conference and the Big 12, but there's also an understanding that there is going to be a learning curve with the coaching change and roster revamp and all that kind of stuff. But I think more than anything, fans are, looking forward to what their team actually looks like and who lines up when they kick off the season.
There's a few spots we feel pretty good about those positions being set. Obviously, Emory Jones, we would expect him to be the first team quarterback. Outside of that, and Corleone, how many spots do you feel like are set for this team?
Yeah, the defense I actually think is probably pretty close to being set. Now there are some newcomers as a part of that, like Dorian Jones is a linebacker who followed Satterfield, and defensive coordinator Brian Brown and those coaches from Louisville. He's a new player, but he's kind of established as one of the middle linebackers. Same thing with Jordan Young. He's a cornerback transfer from Florida who's looked really good, this spring and summer. Yeah, I'm not quite ready to put him on the Sauce Gardner, Kobe Bryant level, but he looks like he could be that kind of next boundary shutdown corner if he keeps playing the way he's looked in preseason. But then, guys, you mentioned Dante Corleone, who, has gotten some first team All-American nods. Juwan Briggs was a former Virginia transfer, was a first team AAC player last year. Deshaun Pace, Ivan Pace's younger brother, he'll start at kind of their star position. So I feel like even with some of the new faces, Daniel Greshik was a defensive end transfer they got from Utah State. There's some new additions, but it seems like the defense is more or less set, certainly in terms of contributors and probably even in terms of starters. But the offense, there's still a lot wide open over there. You mentioned Emory Jones. He's kind of the quarterback de facto starter, because he and Ben Bryant were in a quarterback battle in spring, and then Ben Bryant transferred to Northwestern, who was the starter last year. So it's Emory's job to have, basically. And there are some returners at running back. Corey Kiner, a Cincinnati kid who was a former LSU transfer, he'll probably be the starter and kind of workhorse at running back. But the wide receiver room, there is literally only one returning scholarship player who was a receiver last year on this roster. So they brought in a bunch of transfers. They moved Evan Prater, who was a former quarterback, to wide receiver, and like they think he's actually going to play and contribute for them. They brought in a bunch of transfers, have kind of reshuffled the offensive line. So a lot of what camp is even if the coaches feel like they know, all right, these guys are probably who are going to be in the mix at guard or in the mix at wide receiver, it's still kind of figuring out what they look like and, giving them some time to get out there and gel. So defense, I think that the coaching staff feels pretty good about, and that's going to be the strength of this team. Offense, there's still a lot to kind of figure out and discover here over the next couple of weeks before the season starts.
I'm very intrigued by Cincinnati. It's a very different team. I think from the outside, like if Luke Fickell was coming into the Big 12, we'd have very high expectations for Cincinnati, both immediately and long-term, whereas now expectations for Cincinnati are very low from the outside. From a Cincinnati fan perspective, like how do you feel like fans are kind of handling this change? Obviously excited to be joining the Big 12. I feel like a fan base torn about the new head coach, obviously sad to lose Luke Fickell. Like, where do you feel like their kind of heads are at right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because we're still just like 18, 19 months removed from this team playing in the college football playoff.
Yeah.
And at that time, they knew that they had found out that season they were going to the Big 12. So there was this sense that like Cincinnati's going to go into the Big 12 and, be able to compete right away with Luke Fickell. They took a step back a little bit last year, under Fickell. And, I don't know, they would have taken a step back this season, but it was going to be a little bit more of a transition. This was not the playoff team from 2021 by any means. But they had a strong recruiting class, and I think there was a sense that they could come in right away and be in that top half of the conference if Luke Fickell had stayed and they had that stability. Once that change happened and some of the roster turnover happened, I do think the reasonable, rational portion of the fan base, and every fan base has the non-reasonable, non-rational portion.
Of
But the
course.
ones that were rational understood, all right, this is going to be a change. And so, when they were picked 13th in the preseason media poll, I don't think fans were like shocked or devastated by that. I think they kind of expected that because of all the unknowns. So I'm interested to see, once they actually get on the field, are fans as patient and reasonable as they're kind of saying they're going to be now? But honestly, the biggest thing, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this is a fan base and a program that just for so long was desperate to get back to a power conference. They were in the old Big East when that fell apart, and they kind of just got left on the outside looking in. And so as much as they want to come in and compete right away and win, there's also just this like elation of being in a power conference. So if Oklahoma comes in on September 23rd or whatever it is and just blows the doors off Cincinnati and Nippert Stadium, fans aren't going to be excited, but they're going to be excited that Oklahoma's at, a conference opponent in Nippert Stadium, or even moving forward that Oklahoma State and Baylor and Texas Tech, those teams that have such passionate fan bases, Cincinnati feels like they weren't always getting that in the American Conference. And so even if the schedule or the win-loss record doesn't look great this year, I think there's just going to be so much excitement about being in the Big 12 that they'll be able to kind of move past that misery and be excited to be back on that stage.
It's not a perfect equation, but I always found it interesting, like as a podcaster, it's always been easy for me to find people and guests bring on for the other Big 12 teams. And ever since 2021, the Big 12 fan bases have become more connected and more vocal and more online than they already were, with feeling like the whole world was against them. But when it came time to like trying to find shows and guests and things to start talking about the new schools incoming, like the conversation I always had was like, hey, who do I get for this team? And it just didn't seem like the AAC was nearly as connected. Obviously, it's a conference that had gone through, a complete name. It came out of nowhere. It was left of the Big East and some other conferences kind of piled together. But it's never felt like these fan bases united and all these fan bases were vocal and big. And so finding people for some of these schools has been, kind of difficult to reach out to. So which kind of leads to your point, in which I think is interesting, of Cincinnati fans being excited to be part of something that I think one of the things about the 4 schools that were brought in is the like-mindedness of 4 fan bases who really do care about athletics and are very excited. And part of that is having had this success that Houston and UCF and Cincinnati and BYU have had in college football. But it does feel like the Cincinnati Bearcat fans fit with the best of the Big 12. Obviously, there's different things, cinnamon and chili, yada, yada, yada. But it does feel like it does still feel like a fit and a group that makes sense in the Big 12.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And kind of getting much more familiar with that Cincinnati fan base over the past few years, it is passionate and it's very online. Maybe not quite online as the UCF fan base, as I'm sure you've discovered, but like that's part of the reason that has become a little bit of a rivalry. Is yes, those were 2 of the better teams in the AAC over the past few years, but also just 2 of the bigger and more vocal fan bases, and so that kind of naturally became a rivalry because look, there's a lot of great things you can say about like the Tulsa and USF and Temple football programs, and they all have fans, of course, but it's just not at the level that Cincinnati was or Houston was or UCF was. And so for just from talking to Cincinnati fans, like one of the I think most exciting things for them coming into this is like, oh, we get to go on the road to some of these road trips at places where they're going to sell out and where the fans are invested and crazy. And I think people that come to Nippert Stadium in Cincinnati will see that too. And for those online fans, like they were excited to have people on Twitter they could argue with and trade barbs with and stuff like that, because they honestly did not have that for much of the past decade. And so yeah, you're totally right. This is in all ways competitively, financially, but also just in terms of fandom. This is what the Cincinnati program has been striving for a long time now.
I've said for a while, and I'm not the only one, that the team that I think benefited the most in the Big 12 for the 4 teams coming in is West Virginia. Part of that just being proximity, having another team closer to them geographically in Cincinnati, and having UCF because Florida is a state that West Virginia has had a long history of recruiting well. And if you ask West Virginia fans, Cincinnati is not a rival, and they'll go point to the record when the 2 teams are in the Big East, and how fans do that things. If you have to make excuses for why a team is not a rival, blah 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 blah. From a Cincinnati standpoint, like I've seen it said that they're excited to have West Virginia on the schedule. Obviously, there's the Bob Huggins connection that was there, not any longer. From Cincinnati, obviously the UCF kind of rivalry carries over. How excited are they about having West Virginia on the schedule in the conference with them again?
Oh yeah, no, it's huge. There's definitely a nostalgia for those old Big East days of playing West Virginia, and like yeah, I've kind of seen some of that where West Virginia doesn't necessarily claim Cincinnati either. That's like only made Cincinnati fans even more excited. It kind of just gets their gird up a little bit. And here I realize it's not Penn State or Pitt or anything like that, but I think it'll become very quickly a re-energized natural rivalry because of the proximity that you mentioned, because there is a little bit of history there. Neil Brown at Big 12 Media Days had a good quote about kind of that rivalry being reinvigorated, just in part because it's a couple hour drive from Morgantown to Cincinnati, and that's something that West Virginia has not had during its time in the Big 12. So I definitely think that was a selling point for the Big 12. It was a good thing for Cincinnati. And yeah, I think that's very quickly, even if it's just geographically, and that's what the Big 12 is, deciding to make kind of the rivalry. I think it's one that Cincinnati will definitely lean into, and I'm expecting West Virginia fans will quickly kind of lean into as well.
Yeah, however the schedule is going to stack up now that this conference is going to be 16 teams, I expect West Virginia and Cincinnati to be a protected game across all sports. All right, so the conference is going to 16. It's been hard enough for me to try and get used to 4 new teams joining the conference and getting to know them before now. Now I've got to figure out how to get to know Colorado again, as well as Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah. from someone who is now just kind of starting to get his hands into the Big 12 as well and learn more about this conference as you start to expand your coverage for the Athletic, like how do you feel about, forget everything about realignment that's going on in the country, because we all know it's absolutely insane that the Atlantic Coast Conference might be considering two teams on the opposite coast. But just from the Big 12 perspective, like how do you view the Big 12 now that I don't even want to say dust is settled, because it still doesn't feel settled, but where we are right now and where we expect to be in 2024 with 16 teams in this conference?
Yeah, no, it's wild. It'll take some getting used to. I was just, kind of working on some Big 12 preview stuff and was talking to somebody at the Athletic the other day and mentioned the 4 new teams, and they were like, "Which 4 new teams?" Because there's now another 4 new teams that are coming in. I mean, from like just a college football media and fan perspective, I think it's really a fascinating conference. Part of the thing that was exciting about the Big 12, moving forward after Texas and Oklahoma left, was this idea that it was completely wide open, right? That, all these teams involved felt like they could be contenders in the conference, and that there was this opening for anyone to kind of step up and establish themselves as a new alpha dog or anything like that. I think the 4 new teams, feed into that, right? Like, I realize Colorado hasn't been that successful, but there's a bunch of interest and excitement there with Dion. Arizona seems to kind of be definitely moving in a better direction under Jed Fish. So even with it growing to 16 future teams, it still feels like it has that, potential parity and kind of wide open quality when next season comes around. And I think that's exciting for a lot of fans. There might not be the top end, brands or contenders that the Big Ten and the SEC have and all that. But there's also, no offense to Vanderbilt and Rutgers and things like that, there aren't really any of those teams right now in the Big 12. It used to be Kansas, right? And now Kansas seems to have improved. So someone's gonna finish last and have bad seasons the way like Iowa State did last year, or a couple years ago or whatever. But I like, as a fan of a sport that seems to be stripping away the parity more and more. I like that the Big 12 seems to be embracing that or is going to have that, and I assume I'm probably not alone in that.
Yes, much to the chagrin of Utah fans, we still don't feel like there's a team that's going to dominate this conference once the 16 teams are all here. No, we talk about in Big 12 basketball all the time, how it's the best league in men's basketball, period, top to bottom. And the part of that is the top is so good with your Kansas and your Baylor and other teams like Kansas State, Texas Tech, whoever rises up. But even the bottom of the conference is still like at worst KenPom 70th, right? There's no sub 100 KenPom teams in the Big 12, whereas everybody else has at least one, if not a couple. Football is starting to feel the same way, where no, there's not an Alabama, there's not a Georgia, there's not an Ohio State, there's not a Michigan, there's not a consistently dominant you expect to be contending for the playoff every year. That doesn't mean you won't have teams that are good, that don't rise up, that won't potentially get to, especially an expanded playoff and win some games. You just don't have an obvious title contender. But the bottom, because of Kansas's elevation, and even with West Virginia's struggles, they're still not an awful, terrible football team. That the bottom of the Big 12 is by far the strongest of any conference. And while some people say like, well, that doesn't really matter, they're still not very good, I'd still rather know that the competition level and the excitement in the conference from top to bottom, where you get into November and still have like 6, 7, potentially 8 teams in contention for the championship game, as opposed to which of these 3 are going to get cut away and not make it to Atlanta or Indianapolis or whatever. Like, they're still going to be tight contention. And I just like, that is so exciting to fans of the Big 12. And I think it's more of a selling point than some want to give it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of value in starting a season and genuinely, not having the lip service of like, well, it's anyone's, chance to win the conference and it's wide open. Everyone's, 0-0. In the Big 12, I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? Like, starting next season, even this season, because I have learned very quickly how Big 12 fans feel about Oklahoma and Texas. I know that every time the Athletic writes about like Texas, being a Big 12 perennial Big 12 contender, I just go straight to the comments to see all of the people like, reminding us the last time Texas has won a conference championship in the Big 12. But definitely, starting next year from a, kind of brand perspective, but also competitive perspective, who is going into next season just feeling like, wow, we have no chance this year or moving forward. Like, no one is going to feel that way. And to me, that's what's really exciting. And just from talking to whether it's Cincinnati fans or, starting to kind of get a sense of the other fan bases, I think there's a lot of excitement and pride in that.
So as you have begun familiarizing yourself with the Big 12, I'm curious, I'm so used to being the one who's having to familiarize myself with all these new teams. You're someone who's familiarizing himself with the Big 12. What are some things about this conference maybe that you have learned that surprised you or just you found most interesting?
I have the great benefit, especially at Big 12 Media Days a couple weeks ago, is that I work with Sam Kahn Jr. and Max Olson, who are like two of the most tied end people with that conference and know the history and have been to all the places. So that's been kind of really helpful for them to kind of give me a crash course on that. I'm just excited to get to some of these places. I know some of them are not the easiest cities and stadiums to get to, but that this has been brought up a lot with realignment. One of the things that is so special and unique about college football is like the game day in that city, in that town. And it seems like the Big 12 just has so much history and tradition and uniqueness tied in with so many of these places. And so like, I want to go to Lubbock and Stillwater and Ames and just kind of experience what those places are like on a game day. Because for a lot of people that have never been to Cincinnati or Nippert Stadium for a game, I think a lot of times they show up and they're kind of surprised at what it's like and what that stadium is like on game day. And I know that's what it's going to be like for me going to all these places. I'm actually going to Lubbock in a couple weeks to work on a story. And I've had multiple people, oh, have you never been? You're going to get there. It's going to feel like you're at the end of the earth. You're going to think like, what the hell am I doing here? And then you're going to fall in love with it, within a couple hours of being there. And I'm sure that's, you could say that about Manhattan or Lawrence or all these places. And I'm looking forward to experiencing that.
Love it once you're there. Yes. End of the earth only in Lubbock. It is a much bigger and more interesting city than people give it credit for. It really is. Like you have wandered into some lost oasis that you didn't know existed in the middle of the desert, and you're not sure if it's a mirage or not.
I asked if I was like, oh, can I just fly into Dallas and drive? And every single, was like hilariously throwing their head back and laughing at me when I suggested that. So again, these are all just these things that I'm learning about the Big 12 geography.
There's Big 12 geography, and then there's state of Texas geography, which is a whole different thing entirely. Okay. You need two different maps, the US map, and then Texas has an extra added fold out that you're going to use. I know everyone uses phones now. No one uses a paper map. It's insane. Justin, you have been awesome. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to continuing to read more of your work as you expand your coverage. Do me a favor. Where can everybody find the work you do to cover Cincinnati and now the Big 12?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Williams_Justin. There's other famous Justin Williams out there, so I wasn't first on the Twitter handle. But you can find me there. And then, hopefully if people have not subscribed to The Athletic with college football season starting, what better time than to jump in on all of the realignment craziness and the season that's coming up here in a few weeks.
There's a few Big 12 fans who are listening who just rolled their eyes. Like, yes, there are people at The Athletic that not all Big 12 fans are fond of. But Justin does a really good job. And of course, Sam Kahn and Max Olson, who cover the Big 12, do a really good job of covering the Big 12. So if you want to just nitpick about the things you like, that is worth subscribing.
Every time I've had to, get Max Olson's coffee order or pick up Sam Kahn's dry cleaning, like they have been so generous and nice about it. So, definitely get on and support those guys.
I'll make sure and let them know.